Let's talk a little bit about point of view. Another name for point of view is perspective. And the best way to understand it is to look at some subjects and discuss the point of view. So point of view is actually the relationship between the objects that are in a photograph, the ball, the statue, the trees, the bushes, the lines that are in it. It's the relationship between those. And that point of view, or the perspective, is determined by the relationship between the photographer and all those objects. As we change where we are in relationship to them, these objects all appear much different. As we move left or right, the location of this ball in relationship to the statue will change greatly. So the important thing for us to understand is that we need to pay attention to our perspective and to walk around and to look at the subject and give some thought as to what the finished photograph will look like. So let's take this photograph and change the perspective. What's been changed on here is the photographer moved away a little bit, took the zoom lens and zoomed in to make the ball the more dominant object, placing it on the 1/3 line on the left-hand side, and balancing it out approximately on the 1/3 line on the other side with a smaller, lighter object off in the distance. So there's some balance between these two things. Taking the camera and getting down lower in relationship with the subject will tend to make the objects appear larger than they would if we're standing up looking down on them. When you're doing children, you want to get eye level with them. Animals, same thing. And I guess pumpkins too. Now let's look what happens when we change the relationship between the subjects using just the lens on our camera. So we begin with a wide shot, and often a photographer or an editor in a magazine will want to have a wide shot. Sometimes they use the name establishing shot for one like this because it's giving you an idea of the overall environment. And the composition in this one is great. With the boats and the water and the reflection, you can just feel what's happening in here, and you certainly know. But now a different point of view or a different perspective has been used, and the relationship between the objects has changed. The telephoto lens has been used, so the objects all have been compressed. Let's look at what we mean. See the boat and the building and everything, they seemed quite close together. And what the photographer's done is he's stepped a little bit to the right, or perhaps the left, not sure, so that they could get the tree that was there to act as a frame in the foreground. Now it's changed the relationship to our center of interest, to our subject, considerably, and made much more emphasis on the color in this particular scene. Using a telephoto lens always changes the point of view or the perspective. It tends to compress the distances between things and make them appear as if they're right on top of each other, as it's done in this particular photograph, giving much more emphasis on the house in relationship to the trees. Now, leading lines like this one can be used to draw the eye from the left-hand lower corner, and that's where you want your leading lines to be, in the bottom. The bottoms need to be heavy, not tops. Pictures don't feel good if the top part of the picture has the heaviest, most dominant, darkest objects. So our eye is drawn by the lines in this particular pillar into the upper right-hand corner of the photograph. So our center of interest is really in here, in this particular area along the top of the photograph. If the exposure had been better, so that these middle tones showed up better and not so much the sky that was up in here, this would become more dominant. But the point of view, the perspective, was a low camera angle aiming up on the object. On this one, the point of view or the perspective for this one is eye level with the rocks that are right here. So this is the height of the camera when this photograph was taken. It's used to emphasize this line of the pillars that go down here. If we had been higher or lower, this would have changed considerably in the photograph. Now, your relationship to how close you are to the subject makes a big difference. Right off the bat, it's hard to see the center of interest in this photograph, which is the broken bottle. And so one of the rules of composition or of taking your photographs is to get as close to the subject as necessary and include only things in the background that are important to the picture. So either use your zoom lens or use your feet and get close to the center of interest so you can tell a story much better. Now the broken glass in relationship to the rocks in the environment, it's been placed over slightly to the right, so this is our 1/3 line, and this is approximately where our eye is drawn to in the photograph. So all the right things in composition have been used, including giving thought to point of view. Now here we have a nice serene subject. Curved lines like this one add a calm feeling to it, but there's just something kind of blah in this picture. So the photographer simply used his feet, moved a little bit to the left, same basic lake, but now we framed it on the left hand side, got a couple of tree branches and some grass down here on the bottom to anchor this photograph and give that same serene feeling to the lake. Here we have a lighthouse. The lighthouse is a little bit off from being in the 1/3 line. Here's the 1/3 line here. Here's the 1/3 line here. So it's a little bit off, but that's okay. It's balanced out by the heaviness of the rocks that are down here. And this tells a story about the lighthouse and the environment that it's in. But let's take the same lighthouse, walk a little bit to the right on the beach, squat down in the rocks and aim back at the lighthouse. Well, the lighthouse is not the dominant object anymore. The rocks have become the dominant object. All that's changed is from standing here in the rocks to getting right on the rocks and aiming back at what's happening around the lighthouse. An entirely different story, now focusing on the boats and the rocks and the harbor. And maybe you can see the birds that are up here on the right. Now, photographs like this one, you come to a scene, your editor, if you're taking things for a yearbook or a publication, is going to want you to have perhaps a horizontal picture like this one or a vertical shot of the same thing. In either case, the emphasis has been made on the rocks in relationship to the green stuff in the background, to the beautiful green things. If you're photographing kids, get as close as you can. Include as much as you can of their face and their eyes in particular, what we're drawn to in pictures, and eliminate things in the background, either using your zoom lens, move your feet so you can get into a different point of view or perspective, or use your lens aperture to put the background out of focus. In this big giant gear, we needed to get as close as possible to it to eliminate all the junk that's in the background. Now the gear and the shape and the texture and the lines of it have become our dominant element. Getting down low and aiming up towards a smaller subject, a child, tends to make them look bigger and larger. In this case, the photographer was lying in the sand as the kid ran toward. Beware though of your point of view, because sometimes a wide-angle lens and a low camera angle can distort things. The camera in this case was laying right on the table. The photographer was trying to sneak a picture of the child, and so the camera was just sitting there looking at him. Wide-angle lens, but wide-angle lenses make things closer to them bigger than normal. So his arm looks like it's 9 feet long, and this cup looks huge, but it's just a regular drink. The face looks good because it's at a normal distance. This is point of view, and you use this on purpose for emphasis sometimes. But beware, because you don't always want things to look like this. Now let's look at a series of pictures from the same location and see how a photographer can go in and tell a story. So we begin with an establishing shot. This is the environment of what we're about to take. We're going to concentrate on this gate that's down here at the bottom. It's the entrance to this hotel, and we're going to find some boats that are up here on the top of the hill as we round the corner. So using the telephoto lens from where we were standing before, we zoomed in on the on the gate, sorry. And what's happened is telephoto lens compression has dragged all of these things, making them appear really close together and on top of each other. And sometimes that's great. It adds a different point of view or perspective to the picture. But the bushes in the background and the trees that are there and the grass, they've also been compressed too. And this may not be your most interesting photograph if the gate was your subject. So now the photographers walked right up to the gate, intentionally made the gate almost the same size as the last picture, But now the point of view or perspective has changed. We've picked up a lot of material in the background because we're using a wide angle lens, and we don't have as many of the trees off here on the left hand side. Turning the corner, we see these boats, and using the telephoto lens we zoom in on them and we get the color that we see on them. But the trees in the background, because of telephoto lens compression, are right up on top of it. And the boats are emphasized quite nicely, but we can't see the story. And that's maybe what we want, is the color of the boats. But maybe not. Maybe it's actually the color of the boats and the boats themselves that we want. So we change the point of view. Now the photographer has gotten closer. Using a more wide-angle lens, the background is showing up. The distances are not as compressed. They look more normal the way they would have before. But still, maybe it's the boats that we want. So let's change. Now we've gotten lower. Using the wide-angle lens, we're right on the ground, right in front of these boats, kneeling down. Still have the color of the boats, but we're picking up the story of the building in the background. Maybe we want that in the picture. Maybe we don't. The point is to give some thought to it. Now, if the color of the boats and the shape and the way they're organized is the important part of your message, then get as close as possible and get rid of all the leftover stuff. And that's what we've done in the twig that's up between the boats. So I think, wow, that's an interesting story in itself. So the twig has been photographed. It's been strategically placed according to the thirds line. Pictures are much, much more interesting when you place them off-center, particularly on the left-hand side. And the background is slightly blurry, so you can see that there's something there, but it doesn't make really great separation of this branch. So let's take another shot. Now the background, oops, missed a little bit and cut off the top. Got to be careful of that on your point of view, that you're paying attention to what you're cutting and what you're not. But now the aperture has been set to a really low number like f3 or f4 that blurs the background, gives very narrow depth of field, and the background's blurry, and our eye is drawn as a result to the change or the difference between those two things, and we look at the branch. Much nicer. Whoop, now we change the aperture back to a higher number like f22 or f32, and our depth of field has gotten much better, and now the branch has sort of disappeared. Color's great, and our eyes really drawn more down into the boat down here on the left hand side, and not so much to the green things that are up here. Let's look at those again. Boat blurry, boat kind of not part of the boat. The gray one is fine. So by changing the point of view and the perspective on our camera using simply the lens, we change things a great deal. Now here's that same branch from a little bit farther away, aiming back the other direction now. We were over here on the grass for part of the time, and way down here when we first took pictures of the boat. But we've got an entirely different point of view for the same subject. So changing angle, changing location, changing lens can change your perspective. Now the photographer came along this rock and thought it was an interesting combination of rocks and wanted to tell a story about this rock and the lava and all the things that are there. Picked up the grass, took these things, but it just seemed like the relationship between this rock and the things in the background wasn't quite right. So let's look at another photograph. Now, what's the difference between these two? The first one, the second one. What's happened, besides fixing the exposure error on the other one, the photographer walked way far away from this rock, as far away as he could get without falling off the water on the other side. And using the telephoto lens, he intentionally compressed the difference between these, or the distance between these rocks, so that they would appear more on top of each other to tell the story. So a change in point of view, changing the lens, changing the location, can make a major change in the picture. The important thing, give it some thought. Decide what you want to use. Another rock as we begin to finish up our set. Here we have the rock. It's got the photographer for this one pretty much laid down on the ground and aimed up towards the rock, tried to place it along the 1/3 line on the top. It is dead center, and sometimes pictures need to have it that way to have a better balance to the way the picture feels. And all the shapes in here are quite well balanced. But what happens when we take this rock and we just stand up? Oop, now we've got the rock, but we're looking down on it. Different point of view. We're seeing different parts of the rock, the back side of it. It doesn't look so much like a tooth. See over here, it kind of looks like a tooth. And this has now blended itself into the rocks in the background, and we've picked up a lot of things in the background that we maybe don't want in our story. Maybe you want that in the image, but I think the other one looks much better. Here's a typical picture from a vacation. Came across this artifact, this building, this old building, and the photographer just stopped and clicked away. But the